healing has to be holistic. It has to be full sort of picture, big picture. Why? Because the human being is not just a machine. The human being is a soul. The human being is a mind. The human being is the environment, their social circle. All of these affect the human being. Okay? So that's why I think it's very dangerous to talk about only one element of the human. And a lot of times we see these different extremes. Now, I'll talk about a little bit of those, and then I'll get deeper into each of these rooms. You see extremes in our community and in the greater community of just looking at one room. All right, I gave you one example. A lot of the medical field sort of just looks at the biological room, right? Especially conventional medicine, where it's like, oh, you're depressed, you're anxious, here's some medication, it's a chemical thing, period, full stop, no checking of other rooms, right? Yeah? But then there's another extreme. And the other extreme is sort of the self-help trends that we're seeing today. Some of those go to another extreme, which is like, all suffering is just in your head, right? It's just in your head. Like it's all in your thinking. You create your own suffering. Well, no, sometimes there is suffering outside of me too. You understand? So it isn't all just in your head either. Some people, especially we hear this a lot, maybe in our community, is, if you have enough Iman, you will never be sad. You know? A believer will never be sad, right? If you have enough Iman, you'll never have anxiety. You'll never experience any kind of pain whatsoever, as if Iman turns you into some sort of robot, right? Like spiritual robot, right? You just sort of float around, don't experience any negative emotion. How is that possible? If prophets themselves experienced fear and experienced sadness. In the Quran, for example, it talks at length about Musa alayhi salam experiencing fear. This was a theme that was repeated again and again in the story of Musa alayhi salam. Khifa, scared. He was scared, right? He had fear. He was human. He wasn't a robot. Do you think he had some sort of deficiency in his iman? A'udhu billah, he's a prophet. And yet he experienced fear. We know about the sadness that prophets experienced. Sometimes there's this myth that if you have sabr, that if you have iman, you will never feel sad, right? What about Yaqub alayhi salam? What about Yaqub alayhi salam? We're told in the Quran that Yaqub alayhi salam experienced so much grief that he cried until he went blind. He experienced so much grief that he cried until he went blind. And he said to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Yusuf, إِنَّمَا أَشْكُو بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. He says, I indeed complain of my sorrow, of my suffering, of my pain, and my sadness. وَحُزْنِي إِلَى اللَّهِ, to Allah. So what do we learn from this? Well, we learn that he had sadness. We learn that he experienced grief. And yet, he's the same prophet who had what? Sabrun Jamil. You guys understanding what I'm saying here? In the same surah, it describes him as having sabrun jamil, beautiful patience. So the same prophet, the same person who had beautiful patience, also experienced grief, and also experienced sadness, and also cried. So this is a misconception that we have, that iman and sabr turns you into an emotionless robot. Someone who never experiences any emotions, someone who never cries. This idea that sabr means don't show any emotion. Now, you know, it's like you see somebody who's lost a loved one, right? And it's like you can imagine, you know, you're at the aza, you're at the funeral, and you see some members of the family crying, and you see some members of the family not crying. And usually people in their minds will look at the one crying and say, have sabr, right? And then they'll look at the one who's not crying and say, MashaAllah. MashaAllah. Look at the sabr. Which is a very strange criterion for sabr, given that the one who had sabrun jameel cried for decades until he went blind. And that's Quran. I'm not making it up. Like, that's Quran. That's Surah Yusuf. He cried because he missed his son. He cried because of the grief of losing Yusuf alayhi salam. And he cried because he's human. And it doesn't mean you don't have sabr when you grieve and when you cry. So these are some of the misconceptions that we have and some of the extremes that we have. The Prophet ﷺ taught us, when he lost his son, for example, in a very profound hadith, he said, the eyes shed tears and the heart feels grief, but the tongue does not utter except what is pleasing to Allah. So this is sabr. Sabr doesn't mean I don't cry. And sabr doesn't mean my heart doesn't feel grief. This is something prophets experienced. And in fact, crying is part of the healing process.